The machines are silent. The workers are gone. Entire factories across China's coastal regions stand frozen, waiting for orders that will never come. This isn't a slowdown. It's not a temporary adjustment. This is collapse. The American market, once the lifeblood of China's export empire, has been locked out by Trump's 145% tariff wall. The side doors through Vietnam and Mexico, slammed shut by strict origin controls. And the raw materials China needs to keep its factories alive, ethane, propane, critical chips, all trapped behind the same blockade. Beijing talks tough, but behind the scenes, the CCP is quietly slashing its own tariffs, desperately trying to keep production breathing. The question now is simple: how long before the entire system flatlines? It doesn't take much to kill a machine, just cut off its fuel. For China's mighty export engine, that fuel was never just labor or scale. It was the steady, reliable flow of American demand. Billions of dollars worth of orders. Container ships packed with goods. Day and night, factories humming across Guangdong, Zhejiang, Jiangsu, feeding the beast of global consumption. But now, that flow has stopped. The 145% tariff wall didn't just make Chinese products expensive. It made them impossible to sell into their largest market. Overnight, the buyers were gone. No need to negotiate. No need to fight. The orders disappeared. In the factory zones of Shenzhen and Dongguan, managers are walking the shop floors, staring at silent production lines. Once busy workstations now sit empty. Conveyor belts gathering dust. Pallets of unsold inventory stacked higher than the windows. The owner of a mid-sized toy plant in Shantou, speaking off the record, put it plainly, "America was half my business. Now it's zero. Domestic sales? Not enough to pay the power bill." And here's the brutal twist. Even the factories that might still find buyers can't operate, because the supply chain itself, the arteries that keep China's production machine alive, has been cut open and left to bleed out. It's not just about who buys the products. It's about what's needed to make them. China's plastics industry is a prime example. These factories depend on ethane and propane as core raw materials to produce polyethylene and polypropylene, the basic building blocks for everything from food packaging to car interiors. Where does that ethane come from? The United States. Over 90% of it. Beijing slapped back with a 125% retaliatory tariff on U.S. ethane, trying to look tough. But the result wasn't American pain, it was Chinese paralysis. Factories designed specifically to process U.S. ethane can't just switch inputs overnight. Their infrastructure is locked in. Their transport fleet, 12 ultra-large ethane carriers, was built to handle only American shipments. Retooling these plants would take years, not months. The price of ethane doubled, then tripled. Margins evaporated. Factories started running at half capacity, then a quarter, then not at all. One chemical plant executive told Bloomberg anonymously, "We're losing $184 on every ton of ethylene we produce. It's suicide to keep running." The same story repeats across sectors. In electronics, the chips and semiconductors needed to assemble finished goods, largely sourced from the United States. In medical equipment, high-end devices and parts, US-made. In aerospace, the same. Trump's tariff war wasn't just about finished goods. It was about hitting every link in the chain, exposing the dependency Beijing refused to admit. When the inputs dry up, production dies. Beijing's response? Loud on the outside, "We will fight to the end." Quiet on the inside, whispers of tariff exemptions. Semiconductor imports? Quietly waived for certain categories. Ethane? Now rumored to be on the exemption list. But the CCP can't say it out loud, because admitting the truth would mean admitting defeat. So instead, factories wait. Workers sit idle. Orders remain canceled. The factory of the world is being starved from both ends. No buyers. No raw materials. No way forward. This isn't just an export collapse. It's the cutting of the lifeblood that keeps China's economy breathing. And the deeper Beijing digs in, the tighter the noose gets. Beijing keeps telling the world the same story. We can replace America. We have options. But the numbers tell a different story. The truth is, China's export machine isn't just suffering from lost customers. It's trapped, locked inside a supply chain it can't escape. The plan was textbook CCP strategy. If the US blocks the front door, find a side door. Push goods through Vietnam, Mexico, Malaysia. Play the paperwork game. Falsify certificates of origin. Keep the products flowing no matter what. It worked for a moment, but Washington saw it coming. Under Trump's orders, US Customs turned up the heat. New audits, document inspections, origin tracing technologies. Goods rerouted through third countries were flagged, checked, and blocked. One Southeast Asian logistics broker, speaking anonymously to Reuters, put it bluntly, Chinese exporters begged us to relabel their goods as made in Vietnam. But once the US started checking batch numbers and component sourcing, the game was over. The dream of dodging the tariffs through backdoors collapsed. But this wasn't the only trap Beijing walked into, because even if the CCP could sneak products out, it still couldn't keep the factories running. The reason? The same dependence on the United States for raw materials, tech, and critical inputs. Ethane, propane, chips, semiconductors, high-end industrial equipment. The DNA of China's manufacturing power, imported from America. Take the plastics sector again. The ethane cracking plants in China are not designed for flexibility. They're locked into American ethane feedstock. Switching to naphtha or Middle Eastern supply would require a total re-engineering of entire facilities. Billions in capital, years in downtime. Satellite Petrochemical, Wanhua Chemical, the giants of the industry all built on US ethane. And what happened when Beijing threw its 125% retaliatory tariff on ethane? The price soared from $150 per ton to over $330. Margins turned negative. Output dropped by nearly 40% across major players. Some lines shut down entirely. A senior procurement officer at one chemical firm admitted off the record, the tariffs were meant to punish the US, but we're the ones who can't survive without their feedstock. The retaliation backfired. This wasn't just bad policy. It was checkmate, because while Beijing talks self-reliance, the supply chains say otherwise. Semiconductors? The most critical chips still come from the US or US-allied nations like Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea. American equipment is needed for chip fabrication at almost every step. Medical devices? Aircraft components? The same story. The CCP's loudest threats about cutting ties always skip this part. Because the party knows, decoupling works both ways, and China is the side that can't survive it. That's why, behind the propaganda curtain, something else is happening. Insiders at the Ministry of Commerce have leaked that Beijing is now reviewing a tariff exemption list for 131 key U.S. product categories, including ethane, semiconductors, medical devices, and aircraft leasing. On the outside, tough talk. On the inside, quiet surrender. Beijing is being forced to backtrack on its own retaliation, lifting the very barriers it put in place to show strength. But they can't admit it, because that would mean admitting what's really happening. The supply chain isn't under control. It's under siege. The backdoor plan failed. The raw materials are trapped. The factories can't run. And Beijing can't find a way out. This is not a trade war anymore. This is economic asphyxiation, a slow choke that's cutting off the oxygen to the very heart of China's industrial system. And every move the CCP makes to fight back only tightens the grip. It's not a headline. It's not on the front page of the Global Times. But on the ground, in the factories of Shenzhen, Dongguan, Ningbo, and Suzhou, the truth is impossible to hide. China's manufacturing heartland is dying. Walk into the once bustling industrial parks of Guangdong. Where machines used to run 24 hours a day, you now hear silence. Where workers used to line up for overtime shifts, you now see dormitories emptied out. Factory owners standing outside their gates, staring at rows of idle injection molding machines, trying to decide whether to sell them off for scrap or wait for a miracle. There is no miracle coming. The 145% US tariffs were never just about pricing Chinese goods out of the market. They were about breaking the back of the system that Beijing spent decades building. And it worked. One owner of a packaging company in Zhejiang, speaking quietly to local media, put it this way: "We lost 70% of our export orders within 3 months. The US was our main buyer. Without them, we're just sitting here burning cash." But even companies lucky enough to still have some buyers left are facing a second, deadlier problem. They can't afford to operate. The cost of raw materials has surged. US ethane, the feedstock for plastic production, was Beijing's go-to supply line. But with the 125% retaliatory tariffs slapped on it by China itself, the price of ethane imports has more than doubled. Plants designed to process cheap American ethane can't easily switch to other sources. Their infrastructure is locked into those contracts, those specifications, those ships. No ethane, no plastics. No plastics, no exports. Satellite Petrochemical slashed output by 40%. Wanhua Chemical isn't far behind. Smaller suppliers? Many have already shut down. The chain reaction is relentless. The toy factories of Shantou, the electronics plants of Shenzhen, the packaging lines of Dongguan, all starved of both orders and the materials they need to function. One mid-sized toy manufacturer, now liquidating inventory on social media, shared bitterly, "We have tens of thousands of unsold products. Buyers canceled. There's no one left to take them. Domestic buyers won't pay the price we need to survive." Because here's the second punch Beijing didn't plan for. The domestic market cannot absorb the loss. For months, state media has pushed the narrative of internal circulation. If America won't buy, Chinese consumers will. But reality doesn't follow propaganda. In the face of job losses, wage cuts, and mass layoffs, Chinese families are saving, hoarding cash, cutting back on spending. Middle-class consumers aren't buying new appliances. They aren't upgrading their cars. They're not interested in circulating anything. Retail sales are down nearly 10% in Beijing, over 14% in Shanghai. The government has thrown subsidies at the problem, but you can't subsidize confidence. And the layoffs keep coming. A chemical plant worker in Jiangsu told Bloomberg anonymously, the company reduced shifts last month. Now they're asking for voluntary resignations. There's no work, but they won't call it a layoff. They don't want attention. It's not just workers who are getting squeezed. Factory owners themselves are suffocating under mountains of unpaid loans. Many expanded during the boom years, betting on endless American demand. They upgraded facilities, hired more workers, took on debt. Now the orders are gone. The loans are due, and the banks are getting nervous. The silent bankruptcies are piling up. Factory gates locked overnight. Workers left with unpaid wages. Vendors left with unpaid invoices. Owners disappearing without a trace. But Beijing won't report these numbers. Instead, they highlight the rare success stories. A handful of companies managing to sell locally or shift production to niche markets. Meanwhile, the real story remains hidden behind the facade. In the streets of Shenzhen and Dongguan, pawn shops are seeing a surge in customers. Families selling off jewelry and electronics just to get by. The side streets outside factory zones fill up at night with unemployed workers, huddled together, sharing rumors about which factories might reopen and which are done for good. This is not a downturn. It's not a cyclical slowdown. It's the systematic breakdown of the engine that powered China's rise. And at the center of that breakdown is a simple truth. When your entire economy depends on a buyer who walks away, and on raw materials you can no longer afford, the collapse writes itself. The factories are quiet, but under the silence, the anger is rising. When the export orders disappear, it doesn't just crush production lines, it crushes the people who depend on them. And in China's manufacturing zones, that means millions of workers now standing on the edge, watching their futures vanish. The CCP calls it an adjustment. But for the men and women who packed boxes, ran machines, and loaded cargo ships, this isn't an adjustment. This is economic betrayal. Across Guangdong, Jiangsu, and Zhejiang, the fallout is spreading. One by one, factories are shutting their gates, some quietly, others without warning. Workers show up in the morning to find the doors locked, the managers gone, the wages unpaid. A group of laid-off employees in Dongguan recently staged a protest outside a shuttered electronics plant. Their demand was simple: pay the wages owed. But the police arrived before the chants got too loud. The demonstration was broken up fast, no photos allowed. This is how Beijing handles unrest. Keep it small, keep it quiet, keep it off the internet. But there are cracks that even censorship can't cover. According to labor rights groups tracking incidents across China, the number of wage disputes and factory-related protests has doubled since the tariffs hit, and that number is rising every month. The problem isn't just about missing paychecks. It's about broken trust. For years, Beijing promised that manufacturing would be the foundation of stability. A job at a factory meant more than a paycheck. It meant security. It meant a roof over your head. It meant a future. Now, that promise is falling apart. One migrant worker from Hunan, who spent 7 years on the assembly lines in Shenzhen, told a local blogger, "I came here to work hard and support my family. Now the factory is closed. They didn't even pay us for the last 2 months. I have to go home, but there's nothing there either." Multiply that story by millions. The factory towns were never just about production. They were entire ecosystems: restaurants, markets, schools, clinics, all built around steady jobs. When the factories go dark, those support systems collapse too. And the young people, the so-called ant tribe, university graduates who once believed in China's rising middle class, are facing the same dead end. In 2025 alone, 12 million new graduates entered the job market. But with factories closing and white-collar hiring frozen, they're joining the unemployment lines alongside the factory workers. A graduate from Guangzhou University shared on social media, "My parents worked in the factories. I got my degree to have a better life. Now I'm at home. No jobs, no options." The CCP's plan to replace export demand with internal circulation, domestic sales, local consumption, has hit a wall. You can't power a consumer economy when the consumers have no jobs. Retail sales are dropping across major cities. Credit card defaults are climbing. Auto sales are down. Even food consumption is shifting. More families cutting back on meat, buying staples instead. The middle class, once the symbol of China's success story, is quietly bleeding out. And with each unpaid wage, with each shuttered plant, the frustration grows. Beijing knows this. That's why the police presence around factory zones is up. That's why online posts about wage disputes are deleted within hours. That's why the CCP is ramping up nationalist rhetoric, pointing fingers outward, blaming foreign interference and external forces for the pain felt at home. But slogans don't pay rent. The anger is personal, local, real. For now, the unrest remains scattered. Small protests, quiet acts of defiance. But the economic math keeps getting worse. And the history of China's labor movements is clear. When enough people have nothing left to lose, the spark can catch. The CCP is gambling that fear and control will hold the line. But how many more factories need to close? How many more workers need to go home empty-handed? The question Beijing won't ask. But the streets are starting to whisper. If the system can't give us work, why should we stay quiet? The anger is out there. And the longer this collapse drags on, the harder it will be to contain. Beijing thought it could outplay the tariffs. When Trump hit with the 145% tariff wall, the plan inside Zongnanhai was textbook CCP strategy. Pivot fast, reroute exports through Vietnam, Mexico, Malaysia. Hide the origin. Mask the damage. But the world didn't play along. Washington saw the backdoor schemes coming. Customs and Border Protection enforced new verification rules. Supply chains were audited. Certificates of origin were double-checked, cross-referenced, and flagged. A broker in Vietnam, speaking anonymously to Reuters, described what happened next. "We had dozens of Chinese clients asking to relabel their goods. But the inspections got so strict we couldn't risk it anymore. The U.S. is serious, they're not letting anything slip through." The side doors slammed shut. The reroute plan collapsed. Beijing still had one card left to play, turn to the rest of the world. Sell more to Europe, to Southeast Asia, to Latin America. But there was a problem with that plan too. These markets aren't America. They don't have the same scale. They don't have the same appetite for cheap goods. And they're already under pressure themselves. Europe? Wrestling with its own economic slowdown, rising energy costs, and soft consumer demand. Latin America? Struggling with inflation and unstable currencies. Southeast Asia? Already flooded with low-cost competition. The giant overcapacity of China's manufacturing base, built to supply American scale, had nowhere to go. Meanwhile, American buyers were moving on. Major U.S. corporations, spooked by supply chain chaos during COVID and now hammered by tariffs, began diversifying away from China at record speed. New contracts signed in India. New production lines set up in Mexico. Southeast Asia rising not as China's export vehicle but as its competitor. For the first time in decades, the idea that China was too big to fail in global trade began to look like a myth. Goldman Sachs analysts now forecast that foreign direct investment into China's manufacturing sector could shrink by up to 40% this year alone. Capital is leaving. New investment is going elsewhere. One logistics executive told the Wall Street Journal. When your main customer locks you out and your supply chain depends on their materials, you're not a partner. You're a hostage. And Beijing is feeling the squeeze. It's not just the buyers walking away. It's the raw materials themselves. Remember the ethane crisis? China's plastic giants, satellite petrochemical, Wanhua Chemical, depend on American ethane to produce their core products. Over 90% of their supply comes from the US. The Middle East? Can't match the scale. Norway? Barely a blip on the radar. Beijing's retaliation tariffs on ethane backfired so badly that insiders at the Ministry of Commerce are now quietly pushing for tariff exemptions on up to 131 U.S. product categories, including ethane, semiconductors, medical devices, and aircraft leasing. But they can't admit it. Not publicly. Because to say it out loud would be to admit the truth. China is trapped. The global supply chain is moving on. Buyers are finding new partners. Suppliers are finding new markets. And Beijing is stuck between a collapsing export model and an internal market that can't carry the weight. The CCP's last line of defense is the same as always: control the narrative. Deny the weakness. Blame foreign forces. Talk about self-reliance. But factories are still closing. Workers are still losing their jobs. Orders are still gone. The hard reality is this: the export engine that powered China's rise has no easy road back. The side doors are shut. The supply lines are broken. The world has turned away. And every day that Beijing refuses to admit the scale of the problem, the window for recovery gets smaller. This isn't just a downturn. It's not just a trade dispute. It's the slow-motion unraveling of China's global manufacturing dominance. And once the buyers are gone, once the trust is broken, how do you ever bring them back? The collapse is real. The export engine that fueled China's rise is locked in a supply chain trap with no way out. Factories stand silent. Workers sent home. The raw materials they need, ethane, chips, critical inputs, choked off by Trump's tariff wall. And behind closed doors, Beijing is quietly backing down, quietly waiving the same tariffs they once called retaliation. But they can't admit it. They can't say out loud that the system is breaking from the inside. The question is not if China's manufacturing dominance will return. The real question is, how long before Beijing loses control of the narrative and the people? Tell me what you think below. And stay close. The next leak might change everything.